In the summer of 1931, a psychologist made a decision that would completely horrify modern ethicists. He wanted to find out what happens when you blur the line between human and animal. To do it, he took a 7-month-old baby chimpanzee away from her mother and brought her into his home. There, she was placed in a crib right next to his own 10-month-old biological son. The psychologist set one absolute, unbreakable rule. Treat them exactly the same, feed them the same food, dress them in the same clothes, give them the same toys, kiss them both goodnight, and scold them with the exact same tone of voice. He believed if you raised an animal in a human environment would triumph over genetics. He thought he would watch a chimpanzee gradually learn to walk upright, use a spoon, and eventually speak the English language. The experiment was designed to last for several years. Instead, it had to be abruptly and secretly shut down after just 9 months, because the psychologist didn't change the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee was changing his son. The man behind this was Winthrop Kellogg, a brilliant, intensely curious psychologist at the University of Indiana. Kellogg was obsessed with a question that has haunted thinkers for centuries: how much of who we are is born in us, and how much is poured into us by the world? At the time, scientists were fascinated by stories of feral children, human babies who had supposedly been lost in the wild and raised by wolves or bears. These children always returned to civilization unable to speak, walking on all fours, and completely rejecting human culture. But Kellogg realized these historical accounts were flawed. You couldn't scientifically study a child in the wild after the fact. To truly understand nature versus nurture, you had to do the reverse. You had to bring the wild into the laboratory of the home. Kellogg knew he couldn't legally or morally abandon a human baby in the forest. So, he proposed an alternative. What if we take an animal with a brain remarkably similar to ours, and submerge it entirely in human civilization from infancy? On June 26, 1931, a female chimpanzee named Gua arrived at the Kellogg household. Kellogg's wife, Luella, agreed to the experiment. Together, they treated Gua not as a pet, and not as a lab animal, but as a daughter. And more importantly, as the twin sister to their infant son, Donald. Every single morning, the routine was identical. Donald and Gua were weighed. Their bone growth was measured. They were dressed in matching rompers and shoes. They were placed side by side in high chairs and fed with spoons. If Donald was pushed in a stroller to the park, Gua sat right next to him. If Donald was tucked into bed with a soft blanket, Gua was given the exact same comfort. For the first few months, the results were astonishing. In fact, if you had looked into that nursery in the late summer of 1931, you would have concluded that the chimpanzee was winning. Gua was a prodigy, because chimpanzees mature physically much faster than human infants. She left Donald in the dust during the early stages of the experiment. She learned to walk upright before Donald could. She learned to navigate doors, manipulate doorknobs, and use a spoon with incredible precision. She was toilet trained months before Donald even understood the concept. When it came to understanding language, Gua was brilliant. She couldn't speak, but she could comprehend. If Kellogg said, "Close the drawer," Gua would walk over and push it shut. If he said, "Point to your nose," she would do it. Eventually, she could accurately respond to over 90 distinct words and phrases. To the Kelloggs, it felt like a triumph. Civilization was working. The animal was being tamed. But by the winter of 1931, the trajectory shifted. Gua reached a hard genetic wall. No matter how many times the Kelloggs repeated words to her, no matter how much love they showed her, Gua could not produce human speech sounds. Her vocal cords and her brain architecture simply did not possess the machinery for it. She stopped progressing, and that is when the Kelloggs noticed the true disaster unfolding. Donald was falling behind. Human babies learn by imitation. They look at the dominant creatures in their environment and copy them. Donald looked at his mother and father, but they were adults. The creature closest to him, his daily companion, his twin, was Gua. Donald stopped trying to imitate human speech. Instead, he began imitating the chimpanzee. When Donald wanted food, he no longer pointed or babbled like a human infant. He would sit on the floor and emit a specific, guttural chimpanzee food grunt. He stopped walking upright regularly, opting instead to drop onto his hands and knees, scrambling across the house on all fours exactly like Gua. When he was frustrated, he didn't cry, he bit people. He would stand at the window, scanning the glass, and attempt to catch and eat flies with his mouth. The final straw came when Donald reached 19 months old. At an age when a human child should have been expanding their vocabulary daily, Donald knew only a handful of words. His primary method of communication had become a sharp, distinctive chimpanzee bark. The environment wasn't making the ape human. The environment was making the human an ape. Realizing they were potentially sabotaging their own son's cognitive development, the Kelloggs panicked. On March 28, 1932, the experiment was abruptly canceled. Gua was sent back to a primate colony in Florida. The nursery was dismantled. For decades, the Kellogg experiment was treated as a bizarre, slightly comical historical footnote. a cautionary tale about parenting and scientific hubris. But science eventually caught up to what the Kellogg's had stumbled upon, and the realization was far deeper than they ever imagined. In the decades that followed, other scientists tried to go even further. In the 1970s, a chimpanzee named Nim Chimpsky was raised in a human home and intensively taught American Sign Language. The goal was the same: break the barrier, prove that language is just a matter of education. Nim learned over 100 signs. He could sign banana, play, and hug. For a moment, the world thought the wall had crumbled, but when linguists looked closer at the data, they discovered an uncomfortable truth. Nim wasn't using language, he was imitating behaviors to get rewards. If Nim signed "give banana," it wasn't because he was expressing an internal thought about a banana, it was because he had learned that making those specific shapes with his hands resulted in food. He never asked questions. He never combined signs to form creative, original thoughts. His longest recorded sentence was just a repetitive string of words. Give orange, me give, eat orange, me eat orange, give me, see fly. There was no grammar. There was no syntax. What the Kellogg experiment and the project with Nim Chimpsky proved is that human language is not just a software program that you can install on any hardware. It is the hardware. The human brain possesses a unique, biologically hardwired capacity to look at the chaos of the world, extract abstract rules, and build thoughts that have never been spoken before. A chimpanzee can be surrounded by love, clothing, and human speech for its entire life, but it cannot absorb the structure of a language. It does not have the biological scaffolding to hold. But the terrifying lesson of Little Donald is that the human hardware is fragile. It expects a human environment. If you feed it the wrong data during those critical first months of life, the hardware will gladly adapt to the wild instead. Gua's story ended in tragedy. After spending 9 months being treated like a human child, sleeping in a bed, and wearing shoes, she was cast back into a cage with other chimpanzees. She no longer knew how to be an ape, and she could never be a human. Less than a year after the experiment ended, she died of pneumonia in the colony, isolated and out of place. Donald, once separated from Gua, underwent intensive speech therapy. The chimp barks faded, the biting stopped, and he eventually caught up to his peers. Later, graduating from Harvard University, Winthrop Kellogg thought he was testing the limits of an animal. He thought he was proving that nurture could conquer nature. But what he actually proved is how terrifyingly malleable we are at the beginning. We come into this world incredibly open. A human infant is a creature designed to absorb its surroundings completely. If we are surrounded by speech, we become thinkers. If we are surrounded by silence, our minds stall. And if we are surrounded by the wild, we become wild. Kellogg wanted to see if culture could be forced onto nature. What he found instead is that culture is a fragile, delicate transmission. It is passed down not by instinct, but by the precise, continuous imitation of the humans around us. We are not born with a shield that keeps us human. The shield is built for us by the people who raise us, the words they speak to us, and the behaviors they model. Take away the human mirrors, replace them with the wild, and the reflection changes instantly. We like to believe that our humanity is an unshakable, permanent foundation inside of us, but the 19-month-old boy barking at the window proves otherwise. We are not born human. We mirror into being one.